Welcome to the Norris Group Real Estate Podcast, a show committed to bringing you insights from thought leaders shaping the real estate industry. In each episode, we'll dive into conversations with industry experts and local insiders, all aimed at helping you thrive in an ever-changing real estate market, continuing the legacy that Bruce Norris created, sharing valuable knowledge, and empowering you on your real estate journey. Whether you're a seasoned pro or a newcomer, this is your go-to source for insider tips, market trends, and success strategies. Here's your host, Craig Evans.
Hey, everybody, we're super excited to be on today. We've got a great show. We've got Paul Herrera. He is a government affairs director. Paul serves as an advocate for realtors and their clients on local issues, helping to preserve and protect property rights and the value of home ownership. Working with colleagues at CAR and at NAR, Paul helps members make a difference for their clients at the local, state, and federal levels. His unique experience includes an award-winning journalism career with newspapers in Florida and California, where he covered real estate, small business, the aviation business, and the confluence of government policy, politics, and business. His coverage of real estate and growth in Florida earned him top honors from the Florida Press Club in 2002. In 2004, he won first place for in-depth business writing from the California Newspaper Publishers Association. After journalism, Paul served as communications director for the San Bernardino County Economic Development Agency, coordinating everything from press outreach to speeches and video production. The combination of mass media experience, local expertise, policy, and political background and understanding of real estate issues prepared him to lead IVAR's government affairs and communication efforts through coalition building, strong messaging, and technical understanding. Paul earned his Bachelor of Journalism degree from the University of Missouri at Columbia. Paul, again, man, it is great to meet you officially. You've been a longtime friend of the Norris Group, and it's great to officially meet you and have you on the show. So let me jump right in if we can. With everything going on, we've got an election year. The Norris Group is still in California, where our base is. We're a California-based business. Every election that we have seems to be an opportunity to somehow change how we do real estate in California, right? But before all that happens in November, there's a major change happening in the real estate world and the market. So what I want to do is I want to jump in, and first of all, I want to talk some today about the NAR decision, what's going on in that case, how you see it affecting the market as well as realtors. I know it goes into effect on August 17th of this month. What I don't want to do is I didn't want to wait and cover this in our I Survived real estate event. Matter of fact, we're launching that next week, the marketing for that, getting everything ready. I really wanted to bring you on and let's talk about the things that's on the ballot this year that our investors should be looking at, this NAR decision, how that's going to affect the market. Before we get into that, if we can, let's talk a little bit about you, the Inland Valley Association of Realtors, or IVAR, right? So let's talk about those things, right? So I guess what I want our listeners to do is start to know a little bit about who you are, right? I'm in Florida. My understanding is you lived in Florida for a while. I've been here for, almost 19 years now. So where were you in Florida and how long were you here?
Sure. Let me correct one thing real quick. I actually represent 3 associations of realtors. So okay. One of them is Inland Valleys with its about 4,500 members. I'm also the government affairs director for the Inland Gateway Association of Realtors, which is it's 4,000 members or so, and the California Desert Association of Realtors out in the Coachella Valley, and it's 3,000 members or so. So I don't want them to feel like I'm not representing them. I work with essentially most of the Inland Empire region, with the exception of the High Desert and Southwest Riverside County. But much of Riverside and San Bernardino counties are part of areas that I represent.
Well, so then I will say my apologies to the other associations. I don't ever want to leave anybody out, and quite frankly, that even steepens what we're doing here, because obviously you're representing a huge swath of the agents there in that area. So So I appreciate you correcting us on that. I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
no problem. I know it's confusing because I have bios on each one of the associations, and
Right.
each one obviously refers to their association.
Yep.
So it can be a little confusing there. As far as your question about Florida, I lived in Naples, specifically Bonita Springs. And Bonita Springs was pretty small. This was 2001. It was really just developing. Estero was just coming out of the ground. And I worked for the Naples Daily News, covering from like the Fort Myers area down, not really Naples, but the Florida Gulf Coast University was being planned.
Yep.
There was a race for who would build a large regional mall between Jacobs Group and I can't remember the other one. All kinds of housing was being developed. I learned how to fish in the canals with my old editor boss. Get up in the morning, get chewed up by mosquitoes in the mangrove swamps, and catch a few fish. So I enjoyed Florida.
I did not know because we're out of Fort Myers, so
Oh, okay.
and actually I lived in Florida back for about a 3-year stint,
Mhm.
and I was actually in Bonita Springs at that same exact time. So I
Oh,
moved out in 2001. So that's very. I had no clue about that. I wasn't given that data in your bio or your background. So that's awesome.
yeah.
So
I had a blast in Florida. It was a great place to be.
so how long did you cover real estate in Florida?
In Florida, it was those 2 years. I was a little more general,
Okay.
but if you covered business, I covered business in Florida.
Okay.
But if you covered business in Southwest Florida, you were covering real estate because the business was real estate. There was no way to, be working on business issues and not get into housing.
It's
Yeah,
people always ask me what's the industry down here. I'm like real estate,
yeah, yeah.
real
It's
estate
building housing.
tourism. That's it.
Yeah, yeah. Because even then, I mean, like I said, I covered the development of those new malls that were coming in. So you just had major investment coming in on residential serving retail.
Right.
Prior to that, it was little strip malls, the little tourists serving things, but nothing that was really looking at serving a year-round economy on a large scale. The restaurants would mostly start to wind down when we get to April. When the sun started heating up, then things would really wind down, and uh, that was the economy. I haven't been there now in a good 15 years. Uh,
Oh,
so I haven't, actually 10 years. I was there about 10 years ago. And I could already see, even then, I could see a large difference. And I've never visited Florida Gulf Coast University. That thing was literally a swamp. There was nothing there
yep.
when I left. And now I'm watching them compete on television.
My oldest daughter is actually doing her freshman year of college there. Actually,
Hmm.
so, um, so all right. So you were here. You were in Florida 2 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, just 2 years,
Okay.
2001, 2000, and late 2003. I came back to California.
Okay. All right. So, what do you see then is the biggest difference between California and Florida?
Well, there's a lot of them. If you're talking about
Besides the tax basis.
Yeah, if you're talking about the government side, it's regulatory. Now, some of that there are some commonalities too when it comes to regulation. When I was in Florida, especially in that Estero area in Naples, there were very restrictive local zoning codes and
Yep.
very extensive development procedures going through architectural committees, design review committees, and a lot of layers of approvals that need to happen, even for relatively small projects. Much less, much more so for huge projects that were taking place in the area. In California, those same zoning restrictions are the biggest impediment to building more housing, in particular affordable housing in the region, workforce housing, as we talk about in California.
Yep.
So those things are actually a common through line in a lot of communities across the country, especially fast growing areas across the country. As far as the biggest difference, it's what the state does. It's regulatory. It's the tax situation and how each state views its position. One thing that I remember, another thing that was in common is that Florida essentially has a Prop 13 like California does. Not a lot of states do. Florida has the Save Our Homes Act
Yep.
that essentially does a very similar thing to a Prop 13 does in California. That was another commonality because people saw these very fast rising real estate values as a liability when it comes to your tax bill. When I don't know why we treat houses like it's an income producing asset if it's something you live in. You know, a house is an expense, and if you can't, it's the only quote unquote investment that might produce zero income, but they want to tax it as if it's producing dividends on a
Right.
yearly basis. Um, but Florida and California both recognize that you didn't want to tax people out of their houses. On the regulatory side, there are challenges that are similar because of the population growth, but the responses are very different. Um, California has this sense that from Sacramento they can micromanage the development and even the individual behaviors and interactions between landlord tenants, home buyer, home seller, individual developments and workers. And we always argue that what you want to do is create guardrails and then
Right.
give people maximum freedom to address the marketplace within these guardrails of where you don't want to go. And I think Florida does that pretty effectively. If anything, they can be a little lax on some of those things. You've got to be careful how much room you give. There are areas where you don't want to touch the out of bounds line.
Right. Right.
But you got to be very careful where you place that, and that if anything, you want to be looser than you want to be because uh, the market can respond in a way that government has no idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so in that, when we're talking about what's going on from a regulation and government standpoint, listen, I love looking at data and what's going on with policy and how does policy affect the data and what's coming and what happened 40 years ago. How did policy affect that? Things like that. So, my wife calls me a policy nerd, right? So do you consider yourself, from with what you do in the agencies you represent, do you consider yourself a policy nerd? I guess I would say, do you
Yeah,
focus on it that much,
yeah, that's my favorite part is getting deep into the weeds. Government tends to spend a lot of time as far as what faces the public. You see a lot of posturing over messaging, and I try to spend a lot of time in the details. My view is you can call your bill whatever you want to call it, so long as in the details it does what we need it to do. You can call it the Paul Herrera is a jerk and should be strung up in the town square act if you want. But if in the details of it, it gives me a tax break and build some housing, great. you know, we'll,
Right.
you, we'll go ahead and pretend I'll be strung up.
Right, exactly. So, especially for our listeners on the California side, and really even on Florida side, we're getting a lot of listeners in the Florida side now from a bi-coastal type of thing that we're really working to create. Um, you know, again, based off of our background, I was looking at IVAR, but now that you've talked about the three groups that you work with, and the three agencies, kind of walk us through IVAR and the other agencies, what they are, what they represent, that type of stuff.
Sure. The local associations of realtors are the current version of the trade associations that essentially made real estate work for the last 100 years or so. Um, and they've had to adapt over the years. So you go back, say about 40 years, maybe not quite that long. And if you wanted to create a marketplace to buy and sell real estate, you had to place your listings into a printed MLS. You had to go pick up a book once a week, so you knew what was actually up for sale, and you had to find a way to connect with the people brokering on either side of the transaction. One side brought the buyers, one side brought the sellers. Without the printed listing book and access to the newest version of it, you really were just waiting for the classified ads, I guess, and what was printed in a newspaper come Sunday. But you didn't have the ability to really engage up to the minute. So what the realtors really accomplished was creating a pretty seamless marketplace for buying and selling property, then later adapting that into the multiple listing service as a computerized product. They created all the forms that were part of real estate. So your standard real estate transaction didn't have to be lawyered on every side. And
Right.
instead, you just had this stack of forms that used to be carbon paper and now is all computerized. Um, that could take the place of having a lawyer write up a contract, write up conditions of the contract, and put everything together. So the role of these local associations has been to try to create the most seamless possible marketplace for buying. Essentially, the guts of the marketplace for real estate. Something that if you don't have it, I guess the next best version is what you see in commercial real estate, which is very fragmented. You look
Right.
at commercial, there isn't really like one central database. There isn't one place you can go. You often literally have to drive around, look at
Yep.
signs, and see what fits in what you're trying to get to. And it's far more tedious. But real estate, through the cooperation, really built this system, and even modern products like Zillow are based off of the data integrity, the fact that there's this highly reliable and in fact enforced source of data that the MLSs have created across the country. And the realtor associations were there to try to enforce those data integrity standards, enforce that code of conduct. Sometimes for great results, and sometimes a little more challenging.
So it's funny, as I was sitting there listening to you begin to talk and talking through that process. My whole background is real estate and construction, and for 3 generations now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my mother was actually in the sales side for just shy of 30 years, so probably 27, 28 years, and that ended. I don't know, 16 years ago, 17 years ago. So, so the real estate sales side of that, I remember literally as you were talking through those things, I remember her having to go pick up her book every week when MLS
Yeah,
started coming out. She was picking up her book
yeah,
and working through that, and then trying to work what's in the paper, and then literally driving around, as people would say, I want to live in this area. And she's just driving around and talking and that time still cold calling, you
yeah.
know, um, so, but it's one of those things, we've got a lot of listeners that are new in this industry of investing in real estate and things like that. And it's so interesting that so many people just don't know the history of what these associations are really about. We just take it for granted now, in an
Yeah.
age of data and the internet and everything else, that you can get everything at the drop of a hat. We just take it for granted of what these associations are for. So, what do you think is the most critical function that the local associations, IVAR, and the different ones that you're part of, and all of the associations throughout the country, what do you think is their most critical function that they serve in today's market?
Promoting cooperation,
Uh, uh,
maintaining open lines of communications, and data integrity, but that cooperation piece, and then collectively representing that the needs of home buyers and home sellers on the government plane. We invest a lot more now in lobbying local, state, and federal government than we did in the past, out of need.
Yep.
So let me start with that piece. There is no California Association of Homeownership. There's no Federal Association of Homeownership that's walking around the halls of Congress, or sitting in the lobby in Sacramento, or hanging out at City Hall, presenting the basic case for homeownership. It doesn't exist.
Right.
There's a lot of other groups with a lot of other interests out there who are trying to get their piece, and real estate is highly valuable, so everybody wants a piece of it. But just the basic interests of owning a home, being able to easily buy and sell property, enjoying the rights of ownership, enjoying the rights of investment, that is very fragmented. The realtors, through the government affairs efforts, are really the one group that have the muscle, and muscle equals human beings and money, to engage in that fight without it being a self-serving fight. I mean, one of the really interesting things, and one of the reasons I really enjoy working with the realtors, is until very, very recently, when we're dealing with independent contractor issues that we're trying to defend against, and trying to deal with with commission stuff where it affects state policymaking. I have never been asked to go and lobby bills that put a dollar directly into a realtor's pocket. We've never gone and carried legislation to say you must pay 3% commissions on either side, and we don't engage in that sort of thing. Everything that we've worked on has been about expanding access to home ownership, building more, creating, securing a transaction, getting rid of scam operations, taking advantage of current rules that are hurting home ownership. The theory being that if you promote home ownership as important, that it's not just about renting the house and walls, but the rights to home ownership as it matter, protect a financial interest in it, and help people achieve it. That just based on those things, the realtors will do fine. They don't need someone to force the public to pay a certain amount. We're not a trade union negotiating labor contracts.
Right.
So on that side, that's a function. Then
so really, as I'm listening to that from a business side, because I love business, so really that's actually helping free market function correctly. Then
that's the idea. The challenge always with stuff like this is there's a free rider program, problem, right? In that if you're not receiving a direct benefit, I mean, even unions where they are receiving a direct benefit have a problem with this, with members saying, well, my particular dollar doesn't matter to you. But collectively they all do. So everybody wants to how do I hold my money back while retaining the benefits of what you're doing? Same thing with us. We're trying to protect the central value of home ownership. I mean, we're negotiating between the California Insurance Commissioner and the insurance industry, and we've been the marriage counselor in this whole thing, because our role is we just need this thing to work. We need people to be able to get insurance. We need to be able to afford it. We need to be able to use it, in the case that something happens. And I know you guys are having enormous insurance problems in Florida at the same level, if not worse in some cases than we have in California. And it's becoming a national problem. But,
right.
Ours might be a little more regulatory than yours, but still, the end result is what matters. The end result is, can you insure properties at something reasonably affordable so that people can become homeowners or retain home ownership later on?
Right. Exactly. So how long have you been at IVAR and the other associations that you represent? How long have you been at each of those?
IVAR, I started with them in 2011. Then the other associations became their government affairs director in 2015 and 16.
Okay. So you're pushing a little over 13 years in representing associations of realtors on this. Okay. Yeah. Well, listen, I know a lot of people that are going to be tuning in, listening to this. They're anxious to say, "Hey, great, you guys are talking but get into what's going on with NAR, right?" So let's start talking a little bit about that, right? So, for those of you that are tuning in, and as we're talking about this in March of 2024, this year, the National Association of Realtors agreed to pay $418 million to settle antitrust lawsuits that accuse the organization of inflating real estate commissions. Settlement include changes to the real estate transaction that goes into effect, as we talked about earlier, August 17th of this year, or this year and this month, and are intended to benefit buyers and sellers. So, Paul, as we go through, what I want to do is just start going through some of the things that we've pulled out of the drafts, and let's just talk through some of that.
Sure.
So one of the first things, when it comes to buyer agreements, buyers will be required to sign a written agreement with their agent before touring a home. The agreement must include details about agent commission or compensation, services, and value, and buyers should ensure it reflects the terms they negotiated with their agent.
Yeah.
Diving into that's a whole convoluted conversation. What's your take on that?
My like I've mentioned before, when you and I were talking pre-show, I've got a lot of questions and I lack a lot of answers. And I think
Yep.
we're going to learn a lot of things the hard way over the coming months and years. This What's coming is going to be very, very difficult for buyers, and I can't see it any other way at this time. I understand where the complaints came from on the other side. This idea that sellers always look at the entire bill of things that they're paying for, right? And like, wow, look at all these costs that are piling up in all directions. On the buyer side, though, and that's where I really want to focus on what's going to be the buyer experience. For the
Yep.
buyers, this process has always been simple, right? I have an agent. The agent shows me listings. They drive me around. They help me open up homes, access lockboxes. I can tour. They write offers for me. They make sure all the right boxes are checked. They talk me through the details. They negotiate counters, and we work through the process. And all through these weeks, months, sometimes years in recent time, I pay $0 out of my pocket, and in fact, I will never write a check to this person for the work that they're doing. This changes now, in which the buyer says, "Well, I need your services, I need your help, and so we have to negotiate what I'm going to pay you." So, how exactly that functions, I am really not sure, right? Because if there is no compensation coming to a representative of the buyer, how do you write an offer? How does a buyer write an offer to buy real estate, right? Because you can go to an open house. That's fine. Anybody can walk in an open house and say, "I like this house. I'd like to make an offer." So what? You turn over the back of the open house flyer and you write a number on there and you hand it to the agent, sitting there minding the house. Like, that's not an offer. It kind of is, but it lacks. I don't know what it is in Florida. In California, it lacks about 17 pages worth of fine print that needs to be negotiated out as to what the terms of the offer are and what the contingencies are going to be, what the timelines for performance are going to be, and all these other things. So if I'm on the sell side, I say, "Well, thank you for your offer of $800,000. I'm going to now fill out these 17 pages of information, earnest money deposit and everything else, and say, here you go. And you receive that. You do what with it exactly? If you're underrepresented."
Right.
So you can go to your lawyer and say, "Okay, can you review these documents?" And the lawyer say, "Sure, it's $400 an hour." And I start billing. And every time there's a counter, I don't know what a counter is going to cost, to review the documents. And if you go down that route, alternatively, you work with a buyer's agent and a broker that can walk you through this information. So that's where I go, is how does that impact it? So I think we're going to go through a lot of really difficult scenarios and then start rebuilding a more seamless infrastructure that starts to bring this into something more useful. Or sellers are just going to be in complete control of the transaction going forward.
Well, so one of the things that I haven't been made clear yet. So written agreement, and do you know, does that written agreement, is it per home, or is it per home they show, or is it per buyer that they're representing?
Presumably it would be. I can't imagine a scenario in which you're writing one of these up per home. And more, it would be a letter of engagement, essentially, with a person representing you.
Okay.
So this is one of the things that has to be updated. And that in
Right.
the past, person calls you and says, "Hey, I'd like to look at this property," and you might, drive them around, open up places, and have nothing signed between you. You shouldn't do that, but it could happen because the cooperation was built into the MLS if this buyer bought with you as representative. Now that clearly cannot be the case. You don't want to begin representing yourself as the representative in any way without having that clarified, including the compensation piece.
Yeah, so that almost goes back to, your description. You've got somebody that's hosting an open house. Somebody walks in. So now instead of having a sales contract there, do they have to have a buyer's, an agent, buyer's representative agreement there for them to sign before they can show them the house if they're not being representative or if they're not being represented? That would bring in a tricky conversation because now technically they're there showing a house. It just and that's where our team and the realtors here and the associations here, as we've been talking through, there's so many loose ends that are just as you're saying, unanswered questions.
Yeah. And I mean, this is going to get lawyered to death, I'm sure, right? But let's give the open house scenario. You're a buyer, you walk in, and you say, "Oh, were these this cabinet done recently?" That's fine. You have an agent that's sitting there minding the open house. They can say, "Oh yeah, they just got done 6 months ago," and basic stuff like that. The moment where that clearly goes the other direction is if a representative buyer says, "I'd like to make an offer. Can you help me out with that?" Now, at that moment, you must have some agency relationship, or you have to tell the buyer, "Listen, I'm working with the seller. I cannot represent you." If that's the situation you have with the seller, and if anything, I'm going to have you sign this document that says I have no agency relationship with you whatsoever. So you need to find your own representation somewhere else, or we'll work with you directly. But my interest, my fiduciary responsibility is to the person selling this property and not to you. California, we have dual agency. I don't know Florida's status on dual agency.
You can, yeah.
Okay.
Well, so and that was interesting because I was talking with one of my attorneys, and we were going through this process as well and talking about just that aspect of
Mhm.
you've got so many quote unquote ambulance chasers that are looking for in the medical field, looking for anything of how to create a lawsuit. Even from the legal side, my attorney was saying, we're already talking in the legal field about, how many people are going to go out looking for a way to create a gotcha situation to be able to create an environment in open houses and other venues to where now there can be lawsuits created by breaking those processes and going against what these laws are understand the intention,
Yeah.
but going against that to now create a situation to where you've almost entrapped an agent that's sitting there trying to host an open house because they didn't have a binder agreement for a buyer's agreement.
Mhm.
Now they're at the behest of this person that's walked in. And so there's a lot of questions that are coming out that I don't think anybody has the answers to yet,
Not yet. Now, I suspect real estate agents and brokers will be pretty good at laying out some boundaries, especially, I mean, obviously, some people cut corners, and
Yep.
they would be very unwise to cut corners when it comes to this stuff. But agents are pretty used to dealing with the finer points of this because agents, brokers get asked tax questions, they get asked legal questions. They're often asked to try to play the role of a profession that they're not part of, and they have to
Right.
tiptoe around those questions, and learn how to explain the forms or explain basic aspects of it without providing legal advice. So I suspect agents and brokers are going to be pretty skilled at tiptoeing around this once we have a much clearer handle on where those boundaries are. And I think it'll be easier to create boundaries than to navigate, areas than to navigate it later on.
Well, I think that comes into, as everybody's trying to learn. One of my team leaders here, he made the comment. He said, as we're working through, same thing. I think once we know the boundaries, we'll be able to navigate. It's the
Mhm.
process of just who knows what the boundaries are, trying to learn the boundaries.
I think we're ended up drawing the boundaries on the safe side. That's always going to be the case. And it'll lead to some frustrations saying, you can't even do this for me? I'm sorry. I mean, if I do, it opens up a door. Lawyers are very good at this too. How much advice, they know until you have a letter of engagement with an attorney, there's very little you can do. And you can't go giving people advice on what to do.
Hey, that's going to do it for part 1 with Paul Herrera. Be sure and catch us next week.
For more information on hard money loans, trust deed investing, and upcoming events with the Norris Group, check out thenorrisgroup.com. For more information on passive investing through the DBL Capital Real Estate Investment Fund, please visit dblcapital.com.
The Norris Group originates and services loans in California and Florida under the California DRE license 01219911, Florida Mortgage Lender license 1577, and NMLS license 1623669. For more information on hard money lending, go to thenorrisgroup.com and click the hard money tab.